In a forgotten Kentucky hollow, a girl was born with two different colored eyes. By the age of 10, she was made a bride to her own father. But the true horror isn't just what was done to her, it's what she became. This story forces us to ask, can a victim's silent suffering become a curse powerful enough to poison the very land itself? Some places are not on any map, not because they are lost, but because the land itself refuses to be found. Deep in the Appalachian folds of Breathitt County, Kentucky, there is such a place, a hollow so profound and shadowed that the locals gave it a name that was more of a warning than a title. They just called it the Blackburn place. It wasn't a town, not even a homestead in the proper sense. It was a stain on the landscape, a patch of earth that seemed to have soured from the secrets it was forced to keep. The story, if you can call it that, doesn't begin with a date. It begins with a fear passed down in whispers from one generation to the next, a story that changed in the telling but always circled back to the same rotting farmhouse and the family that dwelled within it like a sickness. The Blackburns. The name itself was spoken with a kind of reluctance, as if saying it aloud might invite its shadow to fall over your own doorstep. The patriarch was a man named Reuben. In the fragments of memory that survive, he is not described as a farmer, but as a warden, a man with a gaze as hard and unforgiving as the winter ground, who carried himself with the grim authority of a king in a kingdom of decay. He worked his land with a silent fury, but the crops that grew were thin and pale, as if they were reluctant to draw sustenance from that soil. He spoke to no one, and no one dared speak to him. His existence was a known fact, like a dangerous rock in a dark river. You simply steered clear. His wife had died years before the whispers truly began to take root. No one remembered her name, only that she had been an outsider, brought to the hollow from somewhere else. The manner of her death was a blank page in the county's already faded records. Some said it was a fever. Others, in hushed tones behind cupped hands, said it was a grief so heavy it simply stopped her heart. She left behind a single child, a daughter. Her name was Clara. And this is where the story truly festers. Clara was not a person to the people of Breathitt County. She was a legend, a ghost you might glimpse from a distant ridgeline, a flash of a white dress moving between the collapsing outbuildings of the Blackburn farm. They said she had eyes of two different colors, one the blue of a summer sky, the other the flat, dead brown of turned earth. It was the first mark of her otherness, the first sign that she was not like the other children in the county who ran barefoot on dirt roads and whose laughter echoed in the hills. Clara's world was bounded by the fence line of the farm. She never went to school. She never came to the sparse country store for supplies. She was a phantom, her existence confirmed only by these fleeting, unsettling sightings. The silence that clung to the Blackburn property was absolute, not the peaceful quiet of the deep woods, but an oppressive, listening silence, the kind that feels heavy, like it's watching you, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. The fear surrounding the Blackburns was a slow-growing thing, nurtured by isolation and ignorance. It began with the small things, a hunter's dog that chased a rabbit onto their land and was never seen again. The strange way the trees on their property seemed to lean away from the house, as if trying to escape its influence. And then there were the stories of Reuben. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a gatekeeper. He kept the world out, but more than that, it felt as if he was keeping something in. And that something was Clara. As the years passed, the legend of the girl with the mismatched eyes grew. She was a part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale told to children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But for the adults, the story held a darker, unspoken question. What happens to a person left behind in a place the world has forgotten? What becomes of a child raised in total silence under the watchful eye of a man like Reuben Blackburn? The answer was a truth too twisted to be spoken aloud, a secret that festered just beneath the surface of their quiet rural lives, waiting for the moment it would finally break through the soil and show its face to the sun. The community did not know the details, but they felt the truth in their bones. The stain on the land wasn't the farm. It was the family. It was the blood. To understand what happened on that blighted patch of land, you have to understand the mind of Reuben Blackburn. This was not the simple, brutal evil of a cruel man. It was something far more terrifying, a philosophy. Reuben was a prophet of his own scripture, the high priest of a religion with only one follower, and its central doctrine was the blood. There are no written records of his beliefs, no gospel of Reuben Blackburn left behind. His doctrine exists only in the scorched earth of his farm and in the fragments of oral history, pieced together from the testimony of a fearful neighbor who claimed to have overheard Reuben's sermons, delivered to no one but the silent, listening trees. He believed the Blackburn lineage was ancient, pure, a direct, unbroken line to a time before the world was corrupted. He saw the burgeoning towns, the railroads, the very idea of progress as a contagion, a sickness that diluted the spirit and thinned the blood. His life, as he saw it, was not one of isolation, but of preservation. He was the guardian of a sacred flame, and his farm was the last temple. His scripture was a scripture of the self. He preached that to keep the blood clean, it must be protected from the outside. But more than that, it must be strengthened from within. A tree that branches too wide, he was heard to say, grows weak. Its wood becomes soft. But a tree that turns back on itself, its branches intertwining, its roots tangling in a tight, closed circle, that tree grows hard as iron. Its wood becomes unbreakable. The Blackburn family tree was not to branch, it was to fold. This was his theology of control. He saw the world outside his fence line as a place of chaos and sin, a world that would devour his daughter Clara. In his twisted logic, building a prison around her was an act of protection. The silence he imposed was not cruelty, it was a shield. The ignorance in which he kept her was not a denial of knowledge, it was a consecration, keeping her mind unblemished by the profane thoughts of a fallen world. He was not raising a daughter, he was forging a holy vessel. His first wife, Clara's mother, had been a mistake, an outsider. Her blood was a weak and foreign element he had tried to integrate, and in his eyes it had failed. She had withered in the hollow, unable to comprehend the sanctity of his mission. Her death was not a tragedy to him, it was a necessary purification, a pruning of a weak branch. It left him with what he believed was his true purpose, his sacred duty, embodied in the daughter she had left behind. Clara was different. She was of his blood entirely. In her mismatched eyes, he saw not a genetic flaw, but a sign, a mark of the old blood, a visible manifestation of its unique power. She was the answer to his prayers, the living ark meant to carry the Blackburn legacy forward, pure and undiluted. She was not to be a daughter in the way the world understood the word. She was to be the future, the next ring in the tight, closed circle of their family tree. Her purpose was not to live, but to continue the line. And to continue it, the line had to return to its source. It had to return to him. This was not a desire. In the dark cathedral of Reuben Blackburn's mind, it was a divine command. And in the absolute silence of that hollow, his was the only voice of God. The ceremony took place on Clara's 10th birthday. There was no cake, no gifts, only a descent into the cold, damp earth beneath the farmhouse. The basement was Reuben's chapel, his holy of holies. It was not a place for storing preserves or sheltering from storms. It was a place of worship. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil, and something else, something metallic and old, like blood that had soaked into the ground and dried a generation ago. This was not love. This was not marriage. It was a sentence, delivered in the dark. Reuben led her down the rickety wooden stairs, his grip on her small arm as firm and certain as a manacle. By the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, the walls came into view. They were covered in symbols, drawn in what looked like a mixture of charcoal and ash. They were not letters or numbers, but strange, spidery geometries, circles within circles, and a recurring motif of a star with too many points, a shape like a shattered compass rose. To Clara, they meant nothing. To Reuben, they were the sacred text of his bloodline. He stood her in the center of the dirt floor, before a flat stone that served as his altar. He wore no special robes, only his usual worn work clothes, yet he carried himself with the terrible solemnity of a priest about to perform a sacrifice. His voice, when he began to speak, was not the harsh tone he used for commands. It was a low, rhythmic drone, a series of guttural sounds that were not quite words, a language he had created for his God and for his blood. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very soil beneath her feet, a sound of things ancient and wrong. Clara stood motionless. Her childhood had not been marked by laughter or play, but by silence and obedience. She had learned early that survival in Reuben's world depended on stillness, on making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She did not understand the meaning of the words he chanted or the significance of the moment, but she understood the feeling that saturated the air. It was the feeling of a door closing forever. The ritual's true purpose was revealed when he produced the tool. It was not a knife from the kitchen. It was a shard of dark volcanic glass, its edges flaked to a keen sharpness, an ancient thing he kept wrapped in a scrap of leather. This was the instrument for the final binding part of the sacrament, the womb seal. He explained it to her in his low drone, his words meant not for her comprehension, but for the sanctification of the act. This mark would seal her. It would close her off from the profane influence of the outside world and consecrate her body as a vessel, a pure and holy receptacle for the continuation of the Blackburn line. There is no way to dress such a truth in softer cloth. It happened, and it happened without resistance, because resistance in her world did not exist. He carved the spoked star, the shattered compass rose, from the wall into the flesh of her lower abdomen, a permanent, painful seal of ownership, a brand. She made no sound. The only noise in the suffocating dark was Reuben's chanting and the soft, wet scrape of the obsidian on her skin.
When it was done, the silence that fell was different from the silence that had come before. It was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the finality of the act. The sacrament was complete. Clara was no longer just a daughter. She was a bride, an altar, a sealed tomb. And in the cold, listening dark of that basement, something had been sown, something that would wait and grow and one day demand to be born. 9 months after the basement sacrament, a harvest came due. The labor was long and silent, a grim ordeal suffered by a child in a woman's body, attended only by Reuben's grim, watchful presence. When it became clear that things were going wrong, he did something he had not done in years. He sought help from the outside. He rode to the farthest edge of the county and summoned a midwife, a woman named Martha Preece, an old woman who was too poor to refuse the silver coins he offered and too tired to be afraid of the legends. What Martha saw in that lamp-lit room would haunt her for the rest of her days. A story she only dared to tell decades later when she was old and believed herself to be beyond the reach of any man's retribution. She spoke of a birth that was not a birth, but an unveiling. The thing that came from Clara's body was born silent and still. It was not a child. In Martha's telling, it was a ledger of every secret the Blackburns had tried to bury. A creature with limbs that were too long and twisted at angles that bone should not bend. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, but its most terrifying feature was its face. It was the face of something ancient, wrinkled and weary, as if it had been born with the weight of 100 years already etched upon it. And its eyes, though clouded by death, were open. They were the same mismatched colors as Clara's, one blue, one brown, and they seemed to hold a dark, knowing stillness, a look that said it had seen the beginning and the end of the world. For Reuben, this was not a tragedy. It was not a failure of his doctrine. To him, the stillborn creature was a harbinger, a necessary sacrifice, a first tithe paid by the bloodline to the hungry soil of their land. He took the small, malformed body from the midwife, wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth, and carried it out into the night. Martha was sworn to silence, a threat of violence hanging unspoken in the air, and sent away with her silver coins. She never spoke of what she saw, not until she was on her own deathbed, and even then she spoke of it as if she feared Reuben could still hear her. Reuben's burial of the creature was another secret ritual. He did not use a shovel. He dug the grave with his bare hands, clawing at the earth behind the barn. He placed the body in the shallow hole and spoke his guttural incantations over it, not as a eulogy, but as an offering. He was planting a seed.
From that day forward, the land itself began to die. It was as if the soil had tasted the poison buried within it and was now rejecting everything. The corn in the fields grew black and withered on the stalk. The water from the well turned brackish and sour with a faint metallic tang. A sickness took the livestock, chickens were found dead in their coop, and the family's milk cow wasted away to skin and bone. A palpable sense of dread began to leach from the Blackburn property, a cold miasm that settled in the hollow and did not lift, even on the brightest days. The land was reflecting the state of the bloodline. It was turning inward, growing sterile and hostile. The first harvest of Reuben's doctrine was not life, but a spreading, quiet rot. Clara survived the ordeal in the way that a tree survives being struck by lightning. She was still standing, but the heartwood had been scorched out of her. The girl she was, if she ever had the chance to be one, was gone forever, replaced by something hollow and silent. After the birth, she stopped speaking, not in a defiant or sullen way, but with a finality that was more profound than any protest. The part of her that formed words had simply ceased to exist. She became a ghost in her own home, a phantom of quiet, unending sorrow. She moved through the decaying rooms with a slow, deliberate grace, performing her chores with a mechanical precision that was devoid of life. She disappeared in plain sight, alive but unseen. Reuben seemed not to notice, or perhaps he saw her silence as the ultimate form of obedience, the perfection of his sacred vessel. But the community, from their distant vantage point, began to notice a change. The strange phenomena that had begun with the blight on the land now seemed to intensify, and they appeared to be centered on Clara herself. A farmer whose land bordered the Blackburn property found his prize bull dead one morning, lying in the field with no mark on it, its eyes wide with terror that had not faded with death. Tools left out in the fields near the Blackburn farm would vanish, only to reappear days later, rusted and bent, as if they had aged a decade in a single night. A profound, unnatural coldness began to emanate from the house, a chill that could be felt even on the hottest days of summer, a cold that seemed to cling to the clothes of anyone who ventured too close to the property line. The fear in the hollow began to shift. For years, the community feared Reuben, the brutal patriarch, the king in his kingdom of decay. But now, a new fear took root, a deeper and more primal dread. They began to fear Clara. The whispers in the dark corners of the county store changed. Was she just a victim, a poor, broken girl trapped in a nightmare? Or had something else taken root in her silence? Had the suffering curdled into something else, something active and malevolent. Had she become the source of the curse?
Her mismatched eyes, once a simple curiosity, now became a source of terror. Those who caught a glimpse of her said her gaze was no longer just empty. It was a geography of loss, a vast, desolate landscape where nothing grew. It was a look that didn't see you, but seemed to look through you at something far away and terrible. The question no one dared ask was the one that mattered most. When you pour that much pain into a single silent vessel, what happens when it finally overflows? The silence of Clara was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy, listening thing that was slowly seeping out of the farmhouse, poisoning the land and changing the very air of the hollow. She was a wound that would not close, and the land itself seemed to be bleeding with her. Several years passed in the suffocating silence of the Blackburn farm. The land remained barren, and Clara remained a ghost. Then another birth. This time there was no midwife, no witness from the outside world. This time the child lived. His name was Elias. Elias was the promise fulfilled, the living embodiment of Reuben's doctrine. He was not twisted and malformed like the harbinger that had come before him. To a passing glance, he might have seemed a normal boy, but to anyone who looked closer, there was a subtle, unnerving wrongness to him. His face had a perfect, cold symmetry, like a porcelain mask. His movements were quiet and deliberate, lacking the clumsy spontaneity of childhood. And he had his mother's eyes, the same mismatched pair, one blue, one brown, the mark of the Blackburn blood. He was born into a world that consisted of three people: his grandfather, Reuben, who was also his father, his mother, Clara, who was also his sister, and himself. His first lessons were not in letters or numbers, but in the scripture of the blood. Reuben, now aging but with a spirit as hard as ever, saw in Elias the culmination of his life's work. He taught the boy the family's sacred history, the doctrine of purity, and the necessity of their isolation. He taught him to see the outside world not with curiosity, but with a deep, ingrained contempt. It was a place of sickness, of dilution, of weakness. The farm was their fortress, and they were the last true humans left on earth. Elias absorbed these lessons in the way that dry soil absorbs rain. He had no other frame of reference. The rotting farmhouse was his entire world. The guttural chants Reuben spoke in the basement were his hymns. The silence of his mother was his normal. He grew up in a house where the lines between love, family, duty, and violence were not just blurred, they did not exist. They were all one and the same, a single, tangled knot of existence. Clara, the silent ghost, was his mother. She tended to him with the same mechanical, lifeless precision with which she did all her chores. She fed him, she clothed him, but she never spoke to him. She never held him with anything that resembled affection. Her gaze would rest on him, but it was a hollow, distant gaze, as if she were looking at a memory or a premonition. To Elias, this was what a mother was: a quiet, sad presence, a necessary part of his world, but not a source of comfort. He was the heir to the cycle of secrets. He was a boy born in a prison and taught to call it a sanctuary.
He was the quiet promise of the bloodline's continuation, a perfect, closed loop of genetics and trauma. As he grew from a boy into a young man, the look in his mismatched eyes began to change. The emptiness that mirrored his mother's was slowly being replaced by something else. A cold, watchful intelligence. The same hard, unforgiving certainty that burned in Reuben's gaze. The fire had been passed. The doctrine had found its new vessel. Time in the Blackburn Hollow did not pass in the way the outside world measured it. It did not march forward in a straight line, but circled back on itself, season bleeding into season, year into year, with nothing to mark its passage but the slow decay of the farmhouse and the deepening of the shadows in the woods. Reuben Blackburn grew old. His body, once as hard as the ironwood he preached about, began to fail him. One winter, a sickness took him, and he died as he had lived. In the cold, silent house, with only the blank stare of his daughter and the watchful gaze of his son to witness his passing. His death did not break the cycle. It cemented it. Elias, now a man, became the new patriarch, the new prophet, the new warden. But where Reuben's control was maintained through brute force and a terrifying loud faith, Elias's was a quieter, more insidious thing. It was the quiet genius of control. He had learned his grandfather's lessons well, but he had refined them. He understood that true power was not in the threat of violence, but in the removal of all other possibilities. Under Elias's rule, the Blackburn family tree stopped branching entirely. It began to fold in on itself like a noose. He took his own sisters, daughters born to the silent Clara in the intervening years, as wives. They were girls born into the same prison as their mother, taught the same scripture of fear and isolation. They knew no other world, no other men, no other life. Their existence was a closed loop. Undocumented children were born, their births unrecorded, their lives lived entirely in the shadows of the decaying homestead. These children, in turn, grew up seeing only each other, their world populated by a congregation of mirrors, every face reflecting the same trapped lineage, the same mismatched eyes.
The Blackburn genealogy was no longer a tree. It was a spider web, tangled and tight and claustrophobic. It was a snake devouring its own tail. From a distance, the family seemed to shrink, to withdraw even further into the woods. The sightings of them became rarer, more spectral. They were no longer just a local legend. They were ghosts, a family that was slowly erasing itself from the world. The horror was not in an act, but in the system, a self-perpetuating cycle of abuse that was so complete, so all-encompassing, that the prisoners no longer saw the bars. They were convinced that the cage was a sanctuary and that the world outside was the true danger. Elias was not a monster in their eyes. He was their protector, their teacher, the one who kept them safe from the sickness of the outside world. He was the root of the tree, and they were all just branches turning back toward him for sustenance and for life. The doctrine of the blood had become self-sufficient. It no longer needed a prophet to preach it. It was simply the air they breathed, the water they drank, the only truth they had ever known. And in the deep, silent hollow, the family continued to fold in on itself, growing tighter and more tangled, a knot of humanity that the outside world had long forgotten how to undo. And the 1920s, the outside world, with its maps and its census takers, made a brief and half-hearted attempt to intrude upon the Blackburns' self-contained universe.
Progress had come to Kentucky, and with it came the need to draw lines on paper, to give every hill and hollow a name and a number. A young, determined surveyor named Thomas Finch was tasked with charting the most remote sections of Breathitt County, a job no one else wanted. His journey, documented in a leather-bound logbook that now sits in a dusty box in a county archive, provides the first and only official record of the Blackburn family after the death of Reuben. Finch was a man of science and reason, his world made of angles, elevations, and precise measurements. But as he pushed deeper into the backwoods, his clean, logical world began to fray at the edges. The people in the outer hollows warned him away from the Blackburn place, their warnings vague and superstitious. Finch, a man who believed only in what he could see and measure, dismissed their fears as simple ignorance. He pushed on. His logbook entries tell the story of his slow unraveling. He first notes the change in the land itself. He wrote, "The woods grow unnaturally quiet here. No bird song. The air is heavy and cold despite the summer sun." As he reached the edge of the Blackburn property, his compass began to behave erratically. He described the land as feeling uncooperative, as if it were actively resisting his attempts to measure it, to pin it down with lines and numbers. And then he saw them. His first sighting was of a woman, gaunt and spectral, her hair a long, white tangle. She stood in the dark doorway of the rotting farmhouse, watching him. She was unmoving, a statue of sorrow. He noted her eyes, even from a distance. "She has the strangest eyes," he wrote, "like two different colored stones." It was Clara, now an old woman, but still a prisoner in the same house, her silence having deepened over the decades into something that felt like a physical presence. He saw children, too, pale, silent figures who slipped between the trees at the edge of the woods. They moved with an unnerving grace, their faces all sharing the same blank, symmetrical features, and they all had the eyes. "Saw several children today," he wrote, his handwriting growing less steady, "all with the same mismatched eyes as the woman. There is a blankness behind their stare, like no one is home. They do not play, they only watch." Finch spent 2 days camped at the edge of the property, trying to make sense of the place, trying to force it to conform to the logic of his maps. He failed. The silence, the oppressive cold, the feeling of being constantly watched by those strange, mismatched eyes, it broke him. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, but his final entry about the Blackburn place is not that of a surveyor. It is a confession of defeat. "Cannot complete the survey of this sector," he wrote. "The land feels wrong. The family does not speak. They only stare. It is as if they are not part of this world. There is nothing to measure here." He packed up his equipment, leaving a large, unmarked blank spot in the heart of his map of Breathitt County. In the margin of that blank spot, he scribbled a single unsettled note, a phrase borrowed from the old fearful maps of a world he no longer understood. "Here be nothing." He had come to chart the land, but he had stumbled upon a place that logic could not touch, a stain that could not be contained by lines on a page. Decades passed. The Blackburn family vanished from sight, and eventually from memory. The fear they had inspired curdled into folklore, a ghost story told by old men on front porches. The farm was abandoned, the land left to its own slow, creeping decay. By the 1960s, the property, long unclaimed, was sold by the county for back taxes. A young couple from the city, full of naive optimism and unaware of the legends, bought it, dreaming of a quiet country life. Their dream would not last long. Their work to reclaim the land became an archaeology of horror. The first discovery came when they tried to plow the field behind the barn, the same field where Reuben had planted his first terrible seed. The plow blade struck something hard. It was not a rock. It was a bone. They kept digging. They found the small twisted skeleton of the harbinger, and then another, and another. A hidden graveyard of undocumented children. Their lives lived and ended in total secrecy. Their small bodies returned to the blighted soil without a name or a marker. The true heart of the darkness, however, was still waiting in the house. During their attempts to renovate the collapsing farmhouse, they tore down a wall in the pantry that seemed strangely thick. Behind it, they found not just studs and plaster, but a hidden, narrow doorway. It led down a set of stone steps into the cold, damp earth. It led to the basement, Reuben's chapel. The air that rose to meet them was ancient and foul, thick with the smell of rot and old secrets. The strange, spidery symbols were still visible on the walls, faded but unmistakable. In the center of the room was the flat stone altar, and on that altar, covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, was a small, rusted tobacco tin. It was not heavy. The man, whose name was David, picked it up. Inside there was no tobacco. There was a single childish locket, the silver tarnished almost black. He pried it open. It was empty. The space where two small portraits should have been held nothing but a dark, hollow void. This was the seed planted in a previous chapter, the object whose significance was now becoming clear. It was a symbol of a life or lives that had been erased. But the final discovery, the one that broke them, the one that sent them fleeing from that place forever, was not in the tin. It was what lay scattered in the dirt floor around the altar. Bones. The skeletal remains of a young woman. The local sheriff, a man old enough to remember the ghost stories of his youth, was called. An investigation was opened and then quickly closed. The official report would list the cause of death as unknown. But the coroner, a young, meticulous doctor from outside the county, noted something in his private files that was never made public. The skeleton belonged to a young woman, likely in her late teens or early 20s, and on her pelvic bone there was a series of strange, intricate scars etched directly into the bone itself. A distinct, star-shaped pattern, the physical, undeniable evidence of the womb seal. The whispers of the past had been given a voice. The folklore was no longer a story. It was a fact, written in bone. The discovery of the graves in the secret basement created a brief, shameful sensation in Breathitt County. For a few weeks, the Blackburn story was a headline, a scandal, a dark curiosity. Then, as these things do, it faded. The shame was too heavy, the story too twisted. The community, complicit in its long decades of silence, chose to forget. The farmhouse was condemned, the land was fenced off, and the forest began its slow, patient work of reclamation, drawing a green curtain over the blighted soil, as if trying to bury the memory for good. But evil doesn't vanish just because it's buried, it festers. The story concludes, but it does not end. The bones found on the farm were sent to a state university for study. In the sterile, logical world of a laboratory, the final chapter of the Blackburn doctrine was written. DNA analysis of the remains revealed a genetic signature so insular, so completely self-contained that it was unlike anything the researchers had ever seen. The family tree did not look like a tree at all. It was a perfect, closed circle, a knot of humanity that had tied itself so tightly it had choked off all outside influence. In a dry, obscure, anthropological paper, it was given a name: the Blackburn anomaly. It was a footnote in the annals of science, a clinical term for a generational nightmare. What happened to the last of the Blackburns, to Elias and the silent children with the mismatched eyes? No one knows for sure. The official record ends with the surveyor's blank spot on the map. The archaeological record ends with the bones in the basement. After that, there is only silence and folklore. Some say they simply died out, their tainted bloodline finally collapsing under its own weight. Others whispered that they are still out there, having withdrawn even deeper into the wild, inaccessible parts of the mountains, a clan of ghosts haunting the ridges. And this is where the story returns to the dark, to the whispers. It becomes a warning, because blood remembers. A house can be torn down, a field can be overgrown, but a bloodline is a living thing, a current that flows through time. The final message of the Blackburn saga is not one of historical horror, but of a chilling, modern possibility. It's a piece of folklore that tells you to be wary of the deepest woods, of the places where the path runs out. It tells you to be careful of any stranger you might meet there, a person with a quiet, watchful stillness and eyes of two different colors. For they may be a living echo of the Blackburn stain, a dormant seed looking for new fertile ground in which to put down roots. Some stories aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be avoided. Thank you for watching Dao Lam Kong.
The darkest parts of American history aren't found in textbooks. They are buried in unmarked graves, in the foundations of rotted-out farmhouses, and in the silence of communities too afraid to speak. The story of the Blackburns is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural. They are the ones we create ourselves, through isolation, through fear, and through the quiet denial of truths too shameful to face. Tell us in the comments what you think happened to the last of them. Did the line die out, or is it still out there, a living echo in the deep woods? Don't forget to subscribe to Dao Lam Khan and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the hidden corners of the past.